I'm going to be honest with you. This building has certain standards. Denise Calloway said it without looking up from her screen, sliding a rental application back across the desk toward Julian Reeves before he had even finished answering her questions. His 7-year-old daughter, Sasha, sat in the chair beside him, swinging her feet, a small backpack shaped like a ladybug resting in her lap. Julian had brought 2 months of pay stubs, a letter from his employer, and enough savings to cover first, last, and a security deposit in full, and none of it had mattered from the moment Denise looked at his work jacket and decided, before reading a single number on the page, exactly what kind of tenant he was going to be. "We typically look for applicants with a bit more financial stability," she said, glancing at Sasha, then back at Julian, her tone carrying the particular politeness people use specifically to make cruelty sound reasonable. What happened over the next 20 minutes would end with Denise standing in the middle of her own leasing office with no explanation left to give, a maintenance worker walking in from the parking lot who recognized Julian's face from the worst night of his own life, and every resident within earshot learning exactly who they had just watched get turned away. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there's more coming. Julian Reeves had built his entire adult life around the discipline of staying steady, and it had not come naturally to him at first. He worked as a transit maintenance supervisor for the city, 5 days a week with rotating overnight shifts twice a month, and he had raised Sasha alone since her mother moved out of state 3 years earlier, an arrangement that had started as temporary and quietly become permanent in the way some absences do. He was 36, compact and solidly built, with a watchfulness in his eyes that most people mistook for distraction rather than what it actually was, a habit of scanning a room that had never fully left him. He did not talk about the 8 years he had spent as a homicide detective before the transit job, the promotion he had walked away from, or the case that had finally convinced him the hours were incompatible with the kind of father he wanted to be for a daughter who was going to grow up faster than he was ready for, regardless of what he chose. He did not miss the badge most days. He missed, sometimes, the particular clarity of a job where the stakes were never in question, only whether he could get there in time. Sasha knew her father used to be a police officer, the way children know facts about their parents, without absorbing the full weight of them. And she knew he still checked the locks twice before bed. And she knew he never once raised his voice at her, not even the time she flooded the bathroom testing whether her rubber ducks could survive a wave machine made from a hairdryer. Their apartment, the one they were about to lose, had been the only home Sasha really remembered. And Julian had spent the 6 weeks since the sale notice arrived trying to keep the disruption from landing on her the way it had landed on him. He had a system for most things, a folder for bills, a folder for Sasha's school paperwork, a folder now for apartment applications that he updated after every viewing, because he had learned in 8 years of detective work that organization was often the only thing standing between a bad day and a genuinely catastrophic one. He coached Sasha's youth soccer team on Saturday afternoons when his shift schedule allowed, not because he understood soccer with any particular expertise, but because nobody else had volunteered, and Sasha had asked him with an earnestness he could not turn down. He kept a framed photograph of his own father, a transit worker himself for 30 years, on the shelf above his desk, a quiet reminder of the kind of steady, unglamorous provision he had grown up watching, and had decided, somewhere along the way, was worth more than the adrenaline of the job he had left behind. Their old apartment building had been sold to a developer 6 weeks earlier, and the notice to vacate had arrived with 60 days and very little sympathy, forcing Julian into an apartment search he had not planned for and did not have much time to conduct carefully. He had found the listing for Brookstone Commons online, a mid-range complex 20 minutes from Sasha's school, with a 2-bedroom, unit priced within his budget and available immediately. And he had scheduled a viewing and application appointment for a Saturday morning, bringing Sasha along because his sister, who usually watched her on weekends, had a scheduling conflict that week. He had dressed the way he dressed most Saturdays, a plain work jacket over a t-shirt, jeans, because he saw no reason to perform a version of himself he did not actually live in, just to fill out paperwork. and he had brought every document he could think of that might speed the process along. Pay stubs, a letter of employment verification, bank statements demonstrating more than adequate savings. They arrived at the leasing office a few minutes early, a small building near the complex entrance with a row of model photographs on the wall and a faint smell of fresh paint. Denise Calloway greeted them from behind the front desk, mid-40s, dressed in a blazer that seemed calibrated specifically for the role of leasing manager, professional, in a way that felt performed rather than natural. She took Julian's application, glanced at Sasha, and began asking questions in the brisk, efficient tone of someone who had already conducted this exact conversation hundreds of times and had stopped expecting to be surprised by any of the answers. Julian answered everything directly: current employer, length of employment, monthly income, and slid his supporting documents across the desk as each question came up, anticipating what she would need before she asked for it. Denise flipped through the documents without much visible interest, and something in her posture shifted subtly as she reached the pay stubs. A recalibration Julian recognized immediately, because he had seen it enough times over the years to know exactly what it meant. She set the folder down, straightened it unnecessarily, and glanced once more at Sasha before returning her attention to Julian, as though the presence of a child in the room was itself a factor she needed to weigh. "I'm going to be honest with you. This building has certain standards," she said, sliding the application back across the desk toward him. "We typically look for applicants with a bit more financial stability." Julian looked at the numbers on his own pay stub, then back at her. "My income covers the rent by a comfortable margin," he said evenly. "I have savings on top of that covering several months if needed. I'd like to know specifically what about my application falls short of your standards." Denise did not answer the question directly. "There's a process," she said. "Not every qualified applicant on paper ends up being the right fit for the community." The word community landed with a particular weight in the small office, and Julian understood exactly what it was doing there. Sasha, sitting quietly with her ladybug backpack in her lap, looked between the two adults with the careful attention of a child, cataloging something wrong that she could not yet fully name. "Daddy, are we not getting the apartment?" she asked, her voice small but clear enough to carry across the office. Denise glanced at her, and something in her expression flickered, not quite discomfort, but an awareness that the conversation now had an audience she had not fully accounted for. "We're still figuring that out, sweetheart," she said, in the practiced, saccharine tone adults use specifically to diffuse children, rather than to actually reassure them. Julian put a hand lightly on his daughter's shoulder. "We're going to be fine either way, baby," he said, keeping his voice warm and level, the voice reserved specifically for keeping the day's unfairness from becoming her problem to carry. He turned back to Denise. "I'd like you to explain what right fit for the community actually means," he said, "because I've given you documentation that answers every legitimate question about whether I can pay my rent on time, and now you're telling me there's some additional standard I haven't been told about." Denise's expression tightened, the look of someone unaccustomed to being pressed for specifics she had not prepared to give. "We've had some issues in the past with certain types of tenants," she said, and then, apparently hearing how that sentence sounded even as she finished saying it, added quickly, "maintenance issues, noise complaints, that sort of thing." Julian looked at her steadily. "And you've decided I'm likely to be one of those tenants based on what, exactly?" he said. "My jacket. My daughter. The fact that I didn't show up in a suit to look at a 2-bedroom apartment on a Saturday morning." At the desk beside them, a younger leasing agent named Marisol had stopped typing and was watching the exchange with visible discomfort, her eyes flicking between Denise and Julian, without quite committing to a reaction either way. Through the office's front window, a resident walking a dog paused near the entrance, drawn by the rise in tension audible even through the glass. Denise, sensing the ground shifting slightly beneath the conversation, attempted to regain her footing. "I'm simply exercising judgment based on years of experience managing this property," she said, I don't think that requires justification to every applicant who walks through the door. Julian said calmly, it requires justification to me, specifically, right now, because you've made a decision about my daughter's housing based on nothing you've actually verified. A woman in scrubs, apparently a nurse heading home from a shift and stopping by to pay a maintenance fee, had paused near the mailboxes just inside the door, close enough to catch most of the conversation. She glanced at Sasha, still sitting quietly with her ladybug backpack, and something about the sight of a child watching an adult get dismissed so casually seemed to settle any hesitation she had about whether the exchange was any of her business. She did not say anything yet, but she stayed near the mailboxes, rather than continuing on her way, her attention fixed on the desk, with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether the moment would require her to speak up. The resident with the dog had by now stepped inside, ostensibly to ask about a maintenance request, though his attention remained fixed on the unfolding conversation at the desk. He was an older man, retired judging by his midday leisure, and he lingered near the doorway rather than approaching the counter, watching with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to involve himself. Denise, aware of the growing audience, lowered her voice slightly without actually softening its content. Look, she said, we get a lot of applicants who look good on paper and then turn out to be a management headache. I have to protect the property and the other residents. Julian asked her, directly, whether she had any actual history with him, specifically that supported that concern, or whether she was extrapolating from something else entirely. Denise did not answer, which told him everything the silence needed to. Sasha tugged her father's sleeve. Daddy, she said quietly, why does she keep talking about us like we did something bad? We didn't do anything. Julian crouched down slightly to meet her eyes, kept his tone even and warm. You're right, baby, he said. We didn't. Sometimes people decide things about you before they actually know you, and that's a mistake they're making, not a truth about us. I want you to remember the difference. Sasha nodded, filing the distinction away with the seriousness she brought to most things her father told her, though her eyes kept drifting toward Denise with the wary caution of a child assessing something she did not yet have words for. Denise, apparently deciding that de-escalation required a change of subject rather than an actual answer, pivoted. I can put you on a wait list for a unit that might open up in a few months, she said, if that's something you're interested in. Julian looked at her for a long moment. I have 60 days to vacate my current apartment, he said. A wait list doesn't help my daughter. What would help is you processing the application I already submitted, with documentation that meets every requirement listed on your own website. Denise's jaw tightened. I've made my assessment, she said. I don't think this unit is the right fit. The older man near the doorway, who had been listening for several minutes without speaking, finally stepped forward. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, addressing Denise directly. I've lived in this complex for 6 years. I've never once heard you use the phrase, right fit, for anyone who walked in here in a suit. Denise turned toward him, visibly irritated. This isn't your business, Mr. Alvarez, she said. He did not back down. I'm a resident, standing in the leasing office, watching how you treat a father and his daughter, he said. That makes it exactly my business. The woman in scrubs near the mailboxes had by now moved a step closer as well, adding, quietly but audibly, I've been standing here 5 minutes, and I still haven't heard a single actual reason. Denise glanced between the two of them, her composure visibly fraying for the first time since the conversation began. Marisol, still seated at her desk, had gone very quiet, her hands motionless over her keyboard, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to contradict her manager directly in front of her. Denise, sensing the room's temperature shifting further away from where she needed it, reached for her phone, apparently intending to call someone, though whether for support or simply to signal that the conversation was over was unclear. It was at that moment that the office's side door opened, and a man in a maintenance uniform stepped in, tool belt still around his waist, drawn by a resident outside who had mentioned that something tense seemed to be happening in the leasing office. He was in his 50s, gray stubble, moving with the tired efficiency of a man near the end of a long shift. And he stopped short the moment his eyes landed on Julian's face, something shifting in his expression that had nothing to do with the apartment complex at all. "I know you," the maintenance man said slowly, his voice carrying an uncertainty that made both Julian and Denise turn toward him. Julian looked at him, searching a face he did not immediately place among the many he had encountered over 8 years of detective work. "5 years ago," the man said, his voice steadier now. "The convenience store on Wexler Avenue. My brother was working the counter that night when 2 men came in with a gun, and it went bad fast. One of them dragging my brother toward the back by his collar, while the other one covered the door." Julian felt something shift in his chest, an old memory surfacing before he had consciously reached for it. Fragments of fluorescent light, and a trembling clerk, and a hostage situation that had stretched into its second hour before anyone else on scene believed it could end without gunfire. "There was a detective who talked his way inside when the negotiator couldn't get anywhere," the man continued. "Walked in unarmed, no vest, just talked to the guy with the gun for 20 minutes until he let my brother go and put the gun down himself. I remember the responding units were furious about it afterward. Said it broke every protocol in the book, but it worked, and my brother walked out of there alive because of it. I saw your face on the news that night, just for a few seconds, before they cut away. I never forgot it. My brother still talks about it. The way you just kept your voice level the entire time. Like nothing about that room scared you at all. He said you never once raised your voice, even when the guy with the gun was screaming at you to back off." Julian stood very still, the weight of that night settling back over him in a way he had not expected on an ordinary Saturday morning. "Detective Julian Reeves," he said quietly. "Retired from that unit 2 years ago. Some nights you get lucky and the training holds. That one held. It could have gone the other way just as easily, and I've thought about that more than I've thought about the fact that it didn't." The office had gone completely silent. Denise's hand had frozen halfway to her phone. Marisol had turned fully around in her chair, her expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. The woman in scrubs near the mailboxes had stopped moving entirely, her hand pressed lightly against her own chest. The maintenance man crossed the remaining distance and gripped Julian's hand with both of his, holding it a moment longer than a simple handshake required. "My brother's got 2 kids now," he said, his voice rough. "Wouldn't have any of that if that night had gone different. I never got the chance to actually thank the man who walked into that room. Didn't think I'd ever get it, honestly." Julian nodded, uncertain what to do with the weight of a gratitude he had not been braced for. "I'm glad he's okay," he said simply. "That's all any of us wanted out of that night." Denise stood behind her desk with the particular stillness of a woman whose understanding of the last 20 minutes had just been completely restructured. She looked at the application still sitting on the desk between them, at Julian, at Sasha, who was watching the maintenance man with wide, careful eyes, piecing together a version of her father she had never heard described in this much detail. "I want this application processed today," Julian said, turning back to Denise, his voice still even, still controlled. "And I want to understand why it almost wasn't, based on nothing more than what I was wearing when I walked through your door." Denise, visibly rattled, mentioned something about standard screening judgment. Julian asked whether that judgment had involved anything besides his clothing, and the fact that his daughter was with him. Denise did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. Only the accumulated weight of a decision made the moment she looked at a work jacket across her desk, and decided what it meant about the man wearing it. "I apologize," Denise said finally, the words arriving stiffly, a woman unaccustomed to producing them without an audience forcing the issue. Julian looked at her for a long moment. "You should," he said. "Not because of anything you just heard about me. Because you looked at a father and his daughter with complete documentation and decided we didn't belong here before checking a single fact. That decision would have been wrong, no matter who happened to be standing in this office. Denise nodded slowly, and something in her expression suggested the distinction had actually registered, even if it had taken an unlikely coincidence to make it land. She did not attempt to explain herself further, which Julian noted, quietly, as the first genuinely honest response she'd given him all morning. The maintenance man, whose name Julian finally learned was Hector Delgado, stayed while Denise processed the paperwork, standing near the desk with the quiet insistence of a man who intended to make sure the outcome matched what he now understood the morning should have looked like from the start. He watched the printer produce each page of the lease with an attentiveness that seemed almost protective, as though his presence alone might keep the process honest, now that everyone in the room knew exactly what honesty required. He crouched down to speak with Sasha, while the lease documents printed. "Your dad's a hero, you know that," he said gently. She nodded slowly, filing the words away with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I knew he used to catch bad guys," she said. "I didn't know it was like that." Hector smiled at her. "The bravest thing about him isn't what happened in that store," he said. "It's that he came home afterward and built a whole quiet life around taking care of you, and never once needed anybody to know the rest of it. That takes its own kind of nerve." On the drive home, Sasha was quiet for a while, working through something in the unhurried way she worked through most things. "Daddy," she said eventually, "why didn't you just tell her who you used to be right away? It would have stopped faster." Julian glanced at her in the mirror. "Maybe," he said. "But then the lesson she'd have learned was that she was wrong to treat us that way, because of what I did years ago. Not because it was already wrong before she knew anything about me at all. I want you to understand the difference, because only one of those is actually true." Sasha considered this for a long moment. "So it's not about you catching bad guys," she said slowly. "It's about just treating people right, because they're people." Julian nodded. "That's exactly it," he said. Sasha nodded back, satisfied, and then asked if they could get pancakes to celebrate the new apartment. Julian laughed, the sound loosening something in his chest that had been tight since the moment Denise first looked at his jacket and decided what kind of tenant he was going to be. He thought about that morning often in the weeks that followed, not with anger, which had never been the feeling he carried longest, but with a plain, clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The property management company's regional director called him personally the following week, an apology delivered without an audience this time, along with confirmation that leasing staff across the company's properties would be receiving retraining on fair housing standards, delivered without Julian needing to ask for either. The director also mentioned, somewhat carefully, that the resident named Alvarez had already filed a written complaint on his own initiative before Julian had said a word to anyone, describing what he had witnessed in detail and requesting that the company review Denise's screening practices more broadly. Julian had not asked for that either, but he appreciated it more than he said out loud. The fact that a stranger had decided the moment was worth documenting before knowing how it would end. He accepted the apology without making more of it than it was. What mattered more to him was quieter than any formal gesture. The fact that his daughter had watched her father hold his ground calmly in a room that had decided to doubt him, had watched people slowly recognize a truth that should never have needed recognizing in the first place, and had learned, without being told directly, that dignity was not something earned by revealing what he had once done. It was something owed simply for showing up as himself, documentation in hand, asking for nothing more than what he had already qualified for. He thought, too, about his own father, the transit worker who had spent 30 years being quietly underestimated by people who assumed a uniform meant less intelligence rather than simply a different kind of work, and about how much of his own composure that Saturday morning had come directly from watching that particular kind of patience modeled for him as a boy, long before he understood what it was actually teaching him. Some mornings, the measure of a man is not the badge he once carried, or the room he once walked into unarmed, but the quiet, steady life he chooses to build, once nobody is asking him to prove anything at all. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.